June 22nd, 1776. New York City. The air, thick with the humidity of early summer, carries the stench of salt marsh, coal smoke, and something else, fear. The city is a powder keg, its fuse sputtering. By day, the sun beats down on the brick facades and dusty streets, illuminating a population fiercely divided. By night, under the flickering glow of whale oil lamps, the shadows lengthen, and secrets fester in the taverns and back alleys. This is not the New York of soaring towers we know today. This is a colonial port on the precipice of war, a strategic prize coveted by two irreconcilable forces. It is a city holding its breath. At his headquarters at Richmond Hill, a stately manor north of the city limits, General George Washington feels the immense pressure of his command. The 44-year-old Virginian, appointed commander-in-chief of the nascent Continental Army just a year prior, now faces his greatest test. He is tasked with defending this vital island city against the most powerful military machine on Earth. From his windows he can see the vast expanse of the harbor, and he knows that just beyond the horizon, the British are coming. Not just a handful of ships, but an armada, a fleet of such staggering size and power that its arrival will signal the true beginning of a brutal, unforgiving war. Every waking moment for Washington is consumed with preparations supervising the construction of forts, drilling his inexperienced troops, and battling the logistical nightmare of supplying an army with dwindling funds and fractured colonial support. The weight of a potential nation rests on his shoulders, and the strain is beginning to show in the lines etched around his piercing blue eyes. But the danger is not just across the water, it is here, inside the city, inside his own army. A cancer of conspiracy is metastasizing within the very heart of the revolution, a plot so audacious, so treacherous, that its success would not merely cripple the rebellion, it would annihilate it. The plot's objective is simple and absolute: to kill George Washington. The conspiracy is a tangled web of allegiances, spun by the deposed but still powerful royal governor, William Tryon, who now orchestrates his schemes from the safety of a British warship, the HMS Duchess of Gordon, anchored in the harbor. His chief agent on the ground is the city's own mayor, David Matthews, a man of wealth and influence who wears a mask of civic duty to hide his fervent loyalty to the crown. Together they have been working for months, using a network of spies, counterfeiters, and informants to sow chaos and undermine the patriot cause. They offer gold, land, and royal pardons to any who will betray the rebellion, and many are listening. The city is rife with loyalists, or Tories, as the patriots call them. Some are wealthy merchants whose fortunes depend on trade with Britain. Others are simple farmers and artisans who fear the chaos of revolution more than the authority of a distant king. They see Washington and his army not as liberators, but as dangerous radicals who threaten to upend their world. This division runs like a deep fissure through families, friendships, and neighborhoods. No one is certain who can be trusted. Every stranger is a potential spy, every friend a potential traitor. This atmosphere of paranoia is precisely what Governor Tryon cultivates. It is the fertile ground in which his conspiracy can grow. The plan is multifaceted, designed to coincide with the British invasion. When the Royal Navy appears, loyalist agents within the Continental Army are to turn their guns on their comrades, spike the cannons in the Patriot forts, and create widespread panic. And in that moment of supreme chaos, a hand-picked team, a group of men who have sworn a secret oath to the king, will strike at the head of the serpent. They will kill General Washington. The key to this final fatal act is a man who stands closer to the general than almost anyone else. A man who wears the uniform of a Continental soldier. A man who is a member of Washington's own personal guard. His name is Thomas Hickey. He is one of the elite soldiers of the Commander-in-Chief's Guard, a unit formed specifically to protect Washington's person, his papers, and his headquarters. They are meant to be the most loyal, the most trustworthy, the most disciplined soldiers in the entire army. Hickey, an Irish-born former British regular, has a silver tongue and a charismatic air that masks a deep-seated cynicism. He has seen the hypocrisy and incompetence on both sides of the conflict, and has decided his loyalty belongs only to the highest bidder, and Governor Tryon pays well. For weeks, Hickey has been a vector of corruption within the army, frequenting the seedy taverns where soldiers and civilians mix, whispering promises of British gold, spreading dissent, and recruiting others to the loyalist cause. He and his co-conspirators have been waiting for the signal, the sight of sails on the horizon. But their whispers have not gone entirely unheard. Rumors have begun to circulate, whispers of a Tory plot, of soldiers being paid in counterfeit money, of a plan to sabotage the city's defenses. These rumors reach the ears of the New York Provincial Congress, the provisional patriot government, struggling to maintain control of the city. They are deeply alarmed. They know that if there is even a kernel of truth to these stories, the entire revolutionary effort in New York is at risk. A secret committee is formed, a small group of trusted men tasked with investigating this shadowy threat. Their work is perilous. They operate in the same murky world of spies and informants as their enemies, knowing that a single misstep could expose them and trigger the very catastrophe they are trying to prevent. They begin their investigation in the city's jails, a breeding ground for rumor and desperation. There they find a man named Isaac Ketchum, a counterfeiter arrested for passing fake bills. Ketchum, facing a long prison sentence, sees an opportunity. He tells the committee that he has information, that he has shared a cell with men who boast of a great plot, a plot involving the royal governor, the mayor, and soldiers in the Continental Army. He names names. One of those names is Thomas Hickey. On this sweltering day of June 22nd, the net begins to close. Based on the testimony of Ketchum and others, the committee acts. A warrant is issued for the arrest of several conspirators, including the most dangerous of them all, the traitor inside the general's own guard. The order is given. Continental officers, their faces grim, move through the city. They know the stakes. They are not just arresting a common criminal. They are confronting a betrayal that strikes at the very heart of their cause. They find Thomas Hickey not at his post, but where he has been spending so much of his time, in a tavern, surrounded by men of questionable loyalty, his purse heavy with counterfeit bills he was distributing as British pay. The arrest is swift. Hickey, perhaps overconfident, perhaps drunk, is taken by surprise. As he is marched through the streets under guard, a palpable sense of shock ripples through the city. A member of Washington's own lifeguard, arrested for treason. The news spreads like wildfire, confirming the darkest fears of the patriots, and sending a jolt of terror through the ranks of the conspirators. The first piece of the plot has been exposed, but how deep does it go? Who else is involved? Is the general still safe? As Thomas Hickey is thrown into a cell, the secret committee knows their work has just begun. They have a traitor in custody, but the full scope of the conspiracy remains hidden in the shadows. And out in the harbor, Governor Tryon watches from the deck of his ship, waiting, wondering if his carefully laid plans are about to unravel, or if the time has finally come to strike. To understand how the American Revolution could come so close to being strangled in its cradle, one must understand the city of New York in 1776. It was not a bastion of liberty, a unified front of revolutionary fervor like Boston or Philadelphia. It was, in truth, a serpent's nest of conflicting loyalties, a place where the ideals of revolution clashed daily with the realities of commerce, class, and deep-rooted allegiance to the British crown. New York was, first and foremost, a port city. Its lifeblood was the river of trade that flowed across the Atlantic, connecting it to the heart of the British Empire. The city's most powerful men, the merchants, the landowners, the lawyers, had built their fortunes on this connection. For them, the crown was not a distant tyrant. It was a business partner. The rhetoric of no taxation without representation that ignited passions in New England was to many in New York's elite a dangerous and foolish abstraction that threatened to upset a very profitable status quo. They were loyalists not merely out of political principle, but out of profound self-interest. They saw the Sons of Liberty as a rabble, a dangerous mob led by upstarts who would bring only ruin and chaos. This powerful loyalist faction did not simply disappear when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. They merely went underground, becoming a fifth column, a hidden enemy, operating within the city walls. At the center of this web of intrigue was a man of immense charm and ruthless ambition, William Tryon, the last royal governor of New York. Tryon was no mere bureaucrat. He was a soldier, a seasoned colonial administrator who had brutally crushed the regulator uprising in North Carolina. He understood power, and he knew how to wield it. Forced to flee his governor's mansion in late 1775 as patriot sentiment grew, he did not retreat to England. Instead, he established a government in exile aboard the warship HMS Duchess of Gordon, anchored defiantly in the harbor. From this floating fortress, Tryon held court, a constant, menacing symbol of royal authority. His ship became the nerve center for all loyalist activity in the region. Spies, couriers, and supplicants rowed out to the Duchess under the cover of darkness, bringing him intelligence and receiving his orders. Tryon's strategy was insidious and brilliant. He knew he could not defeat the Continental Army with military force alone, not yet. So he waged a different kind of war, a war of subversion. His primary weapon was money. He orchestrated a massive counterfeiting operation, flooding the colonies with fake continental currency. The goal was twofold: to provide him with a limitless fund to pay his agents and bribe potential traitors, and to simultaneously destroy the colonists' faith in their own fledgling economy. A worthless currency would mean a starving army, and a starving army could not fight. His chief accomplice in this endeavor, his man on the inside, was David Matthews, the mayor of New York. Matthews was the epitome of the conflicted loyalties that defined the city. Publicly, he maintained a veneer of neutrality, cooperating with the Patriot Provincial Congress to keep the city functioning. He was, after all, the mayor, but privately, he was Tryon's man, heart and soul. He used his official position to gather intelligence on Washington's troop movements, fortifications and supply depots. He helped distribute Tryon's counterfeit money, and most importantly, he served as the primary recruiter, identifying and approaching men who might be turned. Matthews was a master of manipulation, preying on soldiers' grievances, poor pay, terrible food, the fear of dying for a seemingly lost cause. He would offer them a choice: continue to serve a rebellion that could barely feed them, or accept the king's pardon, hard currency, and the promise of land and security once the rebellion was crushed. For many, it was an offer too tempting to refuse. Into this volatile environment marched General George Washington and the Continental Army in the spring of 1776. They arrived fresh from their stunning success in Boston, where they had forced the British to evacuate the city. But Washington was under no illusions. He knew that victory was a temporary reprieve. He wrote to his brother John Augustine that he was moving from one difficult situation to another, and that New York would be the grand contest. He was right. New York was a strategic nightmare. Unlike Boston, which could be fortified from surrounding hills, Manhattan was an island, vulnerable to the Royal Navy from all sides. Washington's army of farmers, shopkeepers and artisans was no match for the professional soldiers and naval supremacy of the British Empire. He knew that a direct confrontation on an open field would be a slaughter. His only hope was to turn the city into a fortress, to build a network of forts and redoubts that could bleed the British and make them pay for every inch of ground. But building forts was only half the battle. He also had to build an army. His troops were raw, undisciplined, and plagued by short enlistment terms. They were a patchwork of militias from different colonies, each with its own customs and rivalries. Forging them into a cohesive fighting force was a monumental task. To protect himself and his command, Washington authorized the creation of a new elite unit. On March 11, 1776, he issued a general order. The general being desirous of selecting a particular number of men as a guard for himself and baggage. The colonel, or commanding officer, of each of the established regiments will furnish him with 4, that the number wanted may be chosen out of them. These men were to be hand-picked. The requirements were strict. They had to be between 5 feet 8 and 5 feet 10 inches tall, handsomely and well-made, and men of good character. They were given new uniforms, distinguishing them from the rest of the army. They were the commander-in-chief's guard, soon to be known as the Life Guard. Their mission was to be the final line of defense for the man who embodied the revolution. It was here, in this select company of trusted soldiers, that the conspiracy found its most crucial asset. Thomas Hickey was, on the surface, an ideal candidate for the Guard. He was an Irishman who had served in the British Army before the war. He was experienced, disciplined, and had a confident air about him. He had deserted the British and joined the Patriot cause, a story that at the time seemed to demonstrate his commitment to liberty. He was accepted into the Life Guard, given a place of honor and trust, a position that brought him into daily proximity to General Washington. But Hickey's heart was not with the revolution. His past was murkier than he let on. He was a professional soldier, a man for whom war was a trade, not a crusade. He had seen the power and professionalism of the British Army firsthand, and he likely viewed the Continental Army with contempt, a disorganized, ill-equipped rabble destined for defeat. He was also a man who enjoyed the pleasures of the city, the taverns, the gambling, the women. These pursuits required money, something the Continental Army provided in short supply. It was this combination of cynicism and greed that made him perfect prey for Mayor Matthews and Governor Tryon. We don't know the exact moment Hickey was turned. It likely happened in a place like the Sergeant's Arms Tavern, or perhaps Corby's Tavern, a known Tory hangout. A quiet word from a recruiter, a flash of silver, a promise of more to come. Hickey began to work for the other side, acting as a recruiter himself. He used his position in the Life Guard to lend himself an air of authority and insider knowledge. He would tell other soldiers that the war was hopeless, that Washington was a fool, that the British were coming with overwhelming force. He would then offer them the deal: join the Loyalist cause, accept the king's pay, and be ready to act when the time came. He found fertile ground. Many soldiers were demoralized. Their pay was often late, if it came at all, and it was in rapidly devaluing paper currency. Hickey offered them hard coin, counterfeit but indistinguishable from the real thing. He became the center of a small but dangerous cell of traitors operating within the army, men who ate the army's food and wore its uniform, while secretly plotting its destruction. The plan they concocted was as simple as it was devastating. When the British fleet arrived, They would enact a coordinated campaign of sabotage. They would set fire to the wooden buildings of the city, creating a massive diversion. They would spike the cannons of the Grand Battery and other key fortifications, rendering them useless. And in the ensuing chaos, Hickey and a few other members of the Lifeguard would seize their moment. The exact method of the assassination was debated among the conspirators. Some sources, though disputed by modern historians, claimed the plan was to poison Washington, perhaps by having Hickey, who sometimes served the general's meals, introduce poison into a dish of his favorite green peas. Another, more likely scenario, was a direct assault. In the confusion of the British landing, with Washington moving to command the defenses, Hickey and his Confederates would turn their muskets on the general, killing him and his staff. The effect would be instantaneous and catastrophic. With its commander gone, the Continental Army would shatter. Leaderless, confused, and attacked from both within and without, it would be annihilated. The revolution would be over. New York would be retaken. The other colonies would quickly fall into line, and the authority of the crown would be restored. It was a perfect plan. It was audacious. And by the third week of June 1776, it was ready to be executed. All they needed was the signal, the first glimpse of the British sails breaking the line of the horizon. The serpent was coiled, ready to strike. As the days of June grew longer and hotter, the pressure on New York City intensified to an unbearable degree. The waiting became a form of torture. Every morning, citizens and soldiers alike would scan the horizon at the Narrows, the entrance to the harbor, half dreading, half expecting to see the vanguard of the British fleet. The tension was a physical presence in the city, a low hum of anxiety that permeated every conversation, every transaction, every moment of quiet reflection. General Washington felt it more acutely than anyone. He was a man besieged, not yet by cannon and musket, but by 1,000 creeping fears and uncertainties. The intelligence reports that crossed his desk were a constant source of alarm. They spoke of a fleet of unprecedented size, over 100 ships carrying more than 30,000 professional soldiers, a force larger than the entire population of Philadelphia, the colony's largest city. Against this, Washington could muster perhaps 19,000 men, many of whom were poorly trained militia, their enlistments set to expire at the end of the year. The disparity in numbers and quality was terrifying. In his letters, Washington struggled to maintain a confident tone, but his private writings reveal a man stretched to his limits. He wrote to the Continental Congress, pleading for more men, more supplies, more guns. He knew that the fate of the American cause rested on his ability to hold this island. If New York fell, the British would control the Hudson River, splitting the New England colonies from the south, a strategic blow from which the rebellion might never recover. This external threat was magnified by the enemy within. The city seethed with loyalist sentiment. Washington was not naive. He understood the political landscape of New York. He wrote that the city and its surroundings were infected with men who are inimical to the cause of America. He knew that Governor Tryon was not merely sitting idle on his warship. He was actively plotting, using what Washington called his unwearied and unremitting pains to undermine the army. The signs of this subversion were everywhere. The counterfeiting scheme was having a devastating effect. Soldiers paid in worthless paper found that merchants would not accept their money. The price of basic goods soared. This economic warfare bred resentment and eroded morale. Why, a soldier might ask himself, should I risk my life for a cause that cannot even afford to pay me in sound currency? It was on this fertile ground of discontent that Thomas Hickey and his fellow recruiters worked their poison. They moved through the army's encampments and the city's taverns like a disease. Hickey, with his easy charm and insider status as a lifeguard, was particularly effective. He would single out soldiers who were grumbling about the conditions, who were homesick, or who simply seemed to lack ideological conviction. He would buy them a drink, lend a sympathetic ear, and then, when the moment was right, he would make his pitch. He would speak of the hopelessness of the patriot cause, the overwhelming power of the British, and the generosity of the king. He would show them the counterfeit bills indistinguishable from real money, and promise them more, along with a full pardon and a grant of land after the inevitable British victory. He was in essence selling a future of security and prosperity in exchange for a single act of betrayal. One of the conspirators later testified that Hickey had boasted he had converted 7 men of the lifeguard alone. While this was likely an exaggeration, the fact that he could even make such a claim speaks to the depth of the penetration. The plot was not limited to a few disgruntled privates. It allegedly reached into the officer corps and even into the artillery units, where the conspirators planned to do the most damage by disabling the cannons. The goal was to create a 5th column that would rise up at the moment of the British attack, a Trojan horse inside the city's defenses. The conspirators held their meetings in secret, often at Corby's Tavern, a known Tory establishment near the Hudson River. There, under the guise of drinking and carousing, they would exchange information, distribute counterfeit money, and swear oaths of loyalty to the king. They were a motley crew: continental soldiers, local loyalists, and common criminals, all bound together by a shared desire for British gold and a cynical disbelief in the American cause. They were playing a dangerous game, and the constant fear of discovery must have been immense. Every Patriot patrol, every inquisitive officer, was a potential threat. To protect themselves, they adopted a system of secret signs and passwords. They were becoming, in effect, a secret society, a cancerous growth within the body of the revolution. Washington, though unaware of the specific plot against his life, was acutely aware of the general threat. The lack of discipline and the growing number of desertions troubled him deeply. He issued stern orders against soldiers visiting the city's tippling houses and brothels, which he knew were centers of espionage and corruption. He worried about the free communication between the city and the British ships in the harbor. Boats were constantly moving back and forth, ostensibly for trade and family visits, but Washington knew they were also carrying intelligence. He wrote to the New York Committee of Safety, the civilian authority, urging them to stop this evil and dangerous correspondence. He felt a growing sense of frustration. He was a military commander, but he was operating in a civilian space where his authority was limited. He could not simply impose martial law. He had to work with the local politicians, who were often slow to act, fearful of alienating a populace that was, at best, ambivalent about the revolution. This political complexity made it incredibly difficult to root out the source of the conspiracy. The Provincial Congress, for its part, was terrified. They were hearing more and more rumors, whispers of a plot so vast it seemed almost unbelievable. They knew that if Washington's army collapsed, they would be the first ones hanging from a British gallows. The pressure to act was immense, but they had to proceed with caution. A full-blown witch hunt would create panic and might drive even neutral citizens into the loyalist camp. They needed proof. They needed a witness. They needed someone on the inside to break. Their opportunity came from an unlikely source. The city jail. The jail was a microcosm of the city itself, a melting pot of debtors, thieves, counterfeiters, and political prisoners from both sides. It was a place of desperation, where alliances were temporary and survival was the only true currency. In this squalid environment, two men, Isaac Ketchum and William Coakley, were being held on counterfeiting charges. They had been part of the very network that Tryon and Matthews were using to destabilize the economy. But now, facing the prospect of the hangman's noose, their loyalty to the crown began to waver. Into this same jail were thrown Thomas Hickey and another soldier from the Life Guard, Michael Lynch, arrested on a minor charge of passing fake bills. It was a fateful mistake by the conspirators. Hickey, arrogant and overconfident, began to boast. He and Lynch talked openly in their cell, believing they were among friends. They spoke of the great Tory plot, of the coming of the British fleet, of the rewards they would receive. They tried to recruit Ketchum and Coakley, urging them to stay true to the king and not to worry about their current predicament, because their powerful friends would soon liberate them. Ketchum listened. He was a criminal, but he was also an opportunist. He saw a path to his own salvation. He realized that the information Hickey was so freely offering was far more valuable than any counterfeit bill. It was a key, a way to unlock his cell door and save his own neck. He made a decision. He would betray the betrayers. Ketchum managed to get a message to the Provincial Congress. He told them he had information of the highest importance. The Congress, desperate for a breakthrough, dispatched a secret committee to the jail. The committee, which included John Jay and Gouverneur Morris, two of the sharpest legal and political minds in the colonies, met with Ketchum in secret. They listened, their sense of alarm growing with every word, as Ketchum laid out the details he had overheard. The role of the mayor, the plan to sabotage the forts, the corruption of the Life Guard, and the ultimate goal of killing the commander-in-chief. It was the confirmation of their worst fears. The whispers were true. The conspiracy was real, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the revolution. The committee now faced a critical choice. They had the word of a known criminal, a man who was clearly trying to bargain for his freedom. Was it enough to act on? Could they risk a confrontation with the popular and powerful mayor based on such a tainted source? The risks were enormous, but the risks of inaction were greater. If Ketchum was telling the truth, then the Continental Army was on the verge of a catastrophic internal collapse. They had to move, and they had to move quickly. The fuse on the powder keg was burning shorter by the second. The whispering city was about to scream. The decision fell upon the shoulders of a small group of men, the secret committee appointed by the New York Provincial Congress. In their hands they held the testimony of Isaac Ketchum, a single, fragile thread. If they pulled on it, they might unravel the entire conspiracy, or it might snap in their hands, alerting the plotters and allowing them to escape, or worse, to accelerate their murderous plans. The committee, led by the astute John Jay, understood the gravity of their situation. They were not acting in a vacuum. The political atmosphere was electric with anticipation and paranoia. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress was debating a resolution that would change the course of history, a formal declaration of independence. The delegates knew that such a declaration would be a point of no return. It would transform their struggle from a rebellion for the rights of Englishmen into an all-out war for national survival. A declaration of independence required a credible army to back it up, and a commander who could inspire confidence. If news broke that this commander's own guards were plotting to murder him, the damage to the Patriot cause would be incalculable. It would be a propaganda coup for the British, proof that the rebellion was a chaotic, self-destructive farce. The delegates in Philadelphia might lose their nerve. The cause could fracture before it was even formally declared. Faced with this immense pressure, the committee made a courageous choice. They would trust Ketchum's story, but they would need to corroborate it. They needed more witnesses, more evidence. Their strategy was to work their way up the chain of command of the conspiracy, starting with the lower-level players and using them to get to the leaders. Their first target was not Thomas Hickey, but a man named Gilbert Forbes. Forbes was a gunsmith in the city, a man known for his loyalist sympathies. Ketchum had identified him as a key paymaster and recruiter for the plot. The committee reasoned that if they could break Forbes, he could lead them to the bigger fish, perhaps even to Mayor Matthews himself. On the evening of June 21st, members of the committee, accompanied by a small detachment of soldiers, led by Colonel William Tudor, descended on Forbes's gunsmith shop. The raid was executed with speed and precision. They found Forbes at his home and placed him under arrest. A search of his property yielded a damning piece of evidence, a significant sum of money that he could not properly account for. Forbes was taken to the city hall for interrogation. He was a civilian, not a soldier, and he likely crumbled quickly under the intense questioning of men like John Jay. He saw the gallows looming. Faced with the choice between loyalty to a distant king and saving his own life, he chose the latter. He confessed everything. He admitted to being an agent for Governor Tryon. He described how he had been paid to recruit soldiers, to administer secret oaths, and to purchase weapons for the Loyalists. He gave the committee a list of names of the soldiers he had personally enlisted in the conspiracy. At the top of that list was Thomas Hickey. With Forbes's confession, the committee now had the hard evidence it needed. The thread had held. They now knew the plot was not just the drunken boasting of a few disgruntled soldiers. It was a well-funded, organized operation directed from the highest levels of royal authority in the colony. The next morning, June 22nd, armed with this new intelligence, the committee authorized the arrest of Thomas Hickey. The capture of a member of the Commander-in-Chief's Guard on suspicion of treason sent a shockwave through the army. It was a stunning public blow to the prestige of Washington's elite unit, but for Washington, it was a necessary one. He understood that the cancer had to be cut out, no matter how painful the surgery. He fully supported the committee's investigation. He knew that military discipline and loyalty were the bedrock of any army, and his was already on shaky ground. He needed to send an unequivocal message: treason would not be tolerated. He wrote to the President of the Continental Congress, John Hancock, informing him of the wicked and diabolical plot. He expressed his hope that the committee would be able to trace it to its source. Washington's decision to trust the civilian committee and to allow the investigation to proceed, even at the risk of exposing embarrassing weaknesses in his own command, was a critical moment. It showed his commitment to the principle of civilian oversight of the military, a principle that would become a cornerstone of the future American Republic. He could have tried to handle the matter internally, to quietly court-martial Hickey and suppress the news. But he knew the conspiracy was too widespread, and the threat too severe. The truth had to come out. Now the committee turned its attention to the biggest target of all, Mayor David Matthews. Arresting a popularly elected mayor was a far more politically explosive act than arresting a common soldier or a gunsmith. Matthews was a powerful figure, a man with many friends and allies in the city. A false move could backfire spectacularly, alienating the city's population and making the Patriot authorities look like tyrants. But the evidence was mounting. Both Ketchum and Forbes had implicated the mayor as a central figure in the plot. The committee issued a warrant for his arrest. In the dead of night, a detachment of soldiers surrounded the mayor's residence at Flatbush. They found Matthews in his bed and took him into custody. The arrest of the mayor was a sensational event. It stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of the conflict in New York. The battle lines were now drawn with brutal clarity. There was no middle ground. You were either with the revolution or against it. Matthews was brought before the committee for questioning. Unlike Forbes, he was a skilled politician and lawyer. He furiously denied all charges, protesting his innocence and accusing the committee of a political witch hunt. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses testified that they had met with him in secret, that he had given them money from Governor Tryon, that he had directed them to recruit soldiers and to be ready to act when the British fleet arrived. The committee concluded that Matthews was a person of a dangerous character and disaffected to the cause of America. He was formally charged with treasonable practices and held in custody. With the key players, Forbes, Hickey, and Matthews, now in custody, the committee worked relentlessly to piece together the full scope of the plot. They interrogated dozens of witnesses, soldiers and civilians alike. A dark and detailed picture began to emerge. The plan was even more extensive than they had first imagined. It was not just about assassination and sabotage. Governor Tryon's ultimate goal was to engineer a full-scale loyalist uprising to coincide with the British invasion. He envisioned the Continental Army being simultaneously attacked from the front by the British regulars and from the rear by thousands of armed loyalists. New York City would be consumed by street fighting and chaos, and Washington's army would be trapped and annihilated on Manhattan Island. The assassination of Washington was to be the trigger, the decapitating blow that would sow panic and confusion in the Continental ranks, ensuring the success of the larger plan. The interrogations revealed the chillingly personal nature of the betrayal. Men who had shared meals and stood shoulder to shoulder on the parade ground were now accusing each other of treason. The bonds of trust that hold an army together were dissolving. The committee's investigation was a race against time. Even as they worked, the threat on the horizon was becoming a reality. On June 25th, a lookout spotted the first sails of the British fleet. It was the frigate HMS Greyhound, carrying General William Howe, the commander of the British forces. Over the next few days, more and more ships appeared, a forest of masts and sails growing in the lower bay. The invasion was beginning. The unraveling thread had led the committee to the heart of the conspiracy, but they had exposed it just as the catalyst for its execution was arriving. The question now was whether they had acted in time. Had they rounded up all the key conspirators, or were there still cells of traitors within the army, waiting for the signal to strike? The fate of the revolution now depended on the outcome of one man's trial. All eyes turned to the court-martial of Thomas Hickey. June 26, 1776. The air in the courtroom, a makeshift chamber in one of the city's public buildings, is thick with a mixture of summer heat and judicial gravity. A panel of 13 senior officers, a military jury, sits at a long table, their faces set in grim lines. This is the court-martial of Private Thomas Hickey, of the Commander-in-Chief's Life Guard. The proceedings are conducted with solemn urgency. There is no time for lengthy legal maneuvering. The enemy is at the gates. The city, the army, and the revolution itself demand a swift and decisive verdict. The charges are read aloud, their words cutting through the tense silence of the room. Hickey is accused of sedition and mutiny, and of holding a treacherous correspondence with the enemies of the colonies. The president of the court, Colonel Samuel Parsons, looks to the accused. Hickey stands before them, his uniform stripped of any insignia, a man alone, his former comrades now his judges. He pleads not guilty. The trial begins. The prosecution, led by the Judge Advocate General, William Tudor, presents its case with methodical precision. They are not merely trying to convict one man, they are trying to expose the entire conspiracy, to lay bare the anatomy of the treason that has threatened to destroy them. They call a series of witnesses, each one adding a new layer of detail to the story of the plot. First comes William Coakley, the prisoner who shared a cell with Hickey. He testifies that Hickey had boasted of his involvement in a Tory scheme, and had tried to recruit him, promising him that the British fleet was coming, and that their friends would soon be in power. Next is Isaac Ketchum, the key informant. He repeats the story he told the secret committee, describing how Hickey and another guard, Michael Lynch, had spoken freely of the plot, of the money they received, and of their plan to join the British army. Ketchum's testimony is crucial. He is the one who first connected the dots, the one who had the courage to sound the alarm. He speaks clearly and confidently, his words carrying the weight of a man who knows he holds the fate of the accused in his hands. Then comes the most damning witness of all, Gilbert Forbes, the gunsmith. Forbes, having already confessed to save himself, has no reason to lie. He testifies that he personally paid Hickey for his services as a recruiter. He describes the secret oaths, the distribution of money, and the central role of Mayor Matthews. Forbes' testimony directly links Hickey to the wider conspiracy and to its leadership. It transforms the case from one of a single soldier's discontent to a coordinated plot against the state. Throughout the testimony, Hickey listens, his expression unreadable. What must he be thinking? Does he feel the noose tightening around his neck? Does he curse his own arrogance, his foolish boasting in the jail cell that led to his downfall, or does he still cling to a sliver of hope that his powerful friends, Governor Tryon and the king himself, will somehow intervene and save him? If so, it is a foolish hope. He is utterly alone. The court gives Hickey a chance to cross-examine the witnesses and to present a defense. He offers a weak and rambling account. He claims that he was not a true conspirator, but had only pretended to be one in order to learn the details of the plot, with the intention of eventually revealing it to his superiors. He says his goal was to cheat the Tories and get their money. It is a desperate, unbelievable story. He provides no evidence that he ever made any attempt to report the conspiracy. He cannot explain why he was actively recruiting other soldiers, or why he was found with counterfeit money in his possession. The officers of the court listen patiently, but their faces betray their skepticism. They are experienced men, leaders of soldiers. They know the difference between a loyal man and a liar. They have seen firsthand the effects of the poison that Hickey and his ilk have been spreading through the ranks. They have seen the erosion of morale, the rise in desertions, the whispers of doubt and defeat. They see in Thomas Hickey not a cunning double agent, but a simple traitor, a man who was willing to sell out his country and his commander for a handful of silver. After Hickey concludes his feeble defense, the court is cleared for deliberation. The 13 officers do not need long. The evidence is overwhelming, the testimony unassailable. Hickey's guilt is beyond any reasonable doubt. They reach a unanimous verdict. The court is reconvened. Thomas Hickey is ordered to stand. Colonel Parsons, the president of the court, rises to read the judgment. The room is utterly silent. The only sound is the rustling of the paper in his hands. He reads the verdict. The court, being cleared, duly considered the evidence, and are unanimously of opinion that the prisoner, Thomas Hickey, is guilty of the charges exhibited against him. Then comes the sentence. For the crime of mutiny and sedition in a time of war, there can be only one punishment. The court sentences Hickey to be hanged by the neck till he be dead. The words hang in the hot, still air. The crisis has reached its climax. The traitor has been judged. The law has spoken. The proceedings of the court-martial are immediately sent to General Washington for his review and final approval. Washington reads the report carefully. He knows that this is a moment of profound significance. The sentence is harsh, but the crime is the most heinous a soldier can commit. He must make an example of Hickey. He must demonstrate to every soldier in the army, and to every loyalist in the city, that the price of treason is death. There can be no room for doubt, no hint of weakness. The survival of the army and the revolution depends on the restoration of discipline and the absolute rejection of betrayal. On June 27th, Washington confirms the sentence. In his general orders for the following day, he announces the court's decision to the entire army. His words are stark and powerful, intended to be read aloud to every regiment. He writes, "The unhappy fate of Thomas Hickey, executed this day for mutiny, sedition, and treachery. The general hopes will be a warning to every soldier in the army to avoid those crimes, and all others, so disgraceful to the character of a soldier, and pernicious to his country, whose pay he receives, and bread he eats." He orders that all troops in the city, except for those on essential duty, are to assemble at 10 o'clock the next morning to witness the execution. It is not to be a private affair. It is to be a public spectacle, a grim and necessary lesson for all to see. As the news of the death sentence spreads, a sense of somber resolution settles over the city. The period of uncertainty is over. The unraveling thread has led to the gallows. The immediate crisis of the conspiracy has been contained. The plot to kill Washington has been foiled. The ringleaders are in custody. The primary agent of their treachery is about to pay the ultimate price, but as Washington signs the order for Hickey's execution, he knows that this is not an ending. It is merely the end of the beginning. He looks out his window towards the harbor, where the forest of British masts continues to grow. The internal threat has been neutralized, but the external threat is now larger and more menacing than ever. The judgment of Thomas Hickey has closed one dark chapter, but a new one, written in blood and cannon fire, is about to begin. June 28, 1776. A humid, overcast morning dawns over New York City. The usual sounds of the bustling port are muted, replaced by a sense of grim anticipation. Today is the day of the execution. By order of the Commander-in-Chief, it is to be a public event, a powerful and brutal piece of political theater designed to sear a message into the mind of every person who witnesses it. The site chosen for the execution is a field near the Bowery Lane just east of the city. A gallows has been constructed, a stark wooden frame silhouetted against the gray sky. It is a simple, terrible structure, a symbol of final, unforgiving justice. Starting around 9 in the morning, the Continental regiments begin to assemble. They march from their encampments in and around the city, their drums beating a slow, solemn cadence. They form up in a vast hollow square around the gallows, a formation of nearly 20,000 men. It is a massive display of military force, a gathering of a significant portion of the entire Continental Army. They stand in silence, their bayonets fixed, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and fear. Many of these men knew Thomas Hickey. They had drilled with him, eaten with him, perhaps even shared a drink with him. Now they are here to watch him die. The message from the high command is unmistakable. This is what happens to traitors. This could be you. Around 11 o'clock the prisoner is brought forth. Thomas Hickey is escorted from his cell under heavy guard. He is placed in a horse-drawn cart, seated upon his own coffin. The procession begins its slow journey through the streets of the city towards the execution ground. The streets are lined with civilians. Their faces are a study in the divided loyalties of the city. Some look on with grim satisfaction, seeing the death of an enemy. Others watch with fear, wondering if their own loyalist sympathies will be discovered next. And many, perhaps most, simply stare in morbid fascination at the unfolding drama. Hickey, for his part, appears composed, almost defiant. A chaplain walks with him, offering words of comfort and prayer. But Hickey seems to pay him little mind. He is a soldier, and he is about to face his final battle. As the cart reaches the field, a deep silence falls over the assembled thousands. The only sound is the creaking of the cart's wheels and the slow, rhythmic beat of the drums. The cart stops at the foot of the gallows. Hickey dismounts. He is escorted up the steps of the scaffold. He stands there for a moment, looking out over the sea of faces, the men he had served with, and the men he had tried to betray. He is given the opportunity to say a few last words. According to some accounts, he uses the moment not to express remorse, but to issue a final, bitter complaint. He allegedly warns the soldiers to be wary of bad women, claiming it was his involvement with them that led to his downfall. It is a pathetic, self-serving excuse, an attempt to shift the blame for his own treason. It is unlikely that many in the crowd are moved by it. General Washington is not on the scaffold. He is present, as protocol demands, but he observes from a distance, mounted on his horse. He watches the proceedings with a stoic, unreadable expression. This is not an act of vengeance for him. It is a grim necessity of command. He is the man who embodies the law of the new nation that is struggling to be born, and that law must be seen to be absolute. The executioner, a professional hangman, places the black hood over Hickey's head and adjusts the rope around his neck. The noose is a simple, efficient tool of death. The chaplain says a final prayer. The drum roll begins, a low, rumbling sound that builds in intensity. The order is given. The cart is pulled away. Thomas Hickey drops. His body convulses for a moment, then hangs limp and still. The first American soldier to be executed for treason in the Continental Army is dead. The silence that follows is profound. 20,000 soldiers and thousands of civilians stand for a long moment, staring at the body swaying gently in the breeze. The message has been delivered. The warning has been given. The traitor has been punished. After a prescribed period, the body is cut down and buried in an unmarked grave nearby. The regiments are dismissed. They march back to their posts, the solemn drumbeat echoing in their ears. The spectacle is over. The immediate aftermath of the execution is a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the army. The easygoing discipline, the lax security, the casual mixing of soldiers and civilians, all of it comes to an end. A new hardness, a new sense of seriousness, takes hold. Washington orders a tightening of security around his headquarters. The life guard is purged and reorganized. No one is above suspicion. The investigation into the wider conspiracy continues, though with less public fanfare. Mayor David Matthews and the other accused loyalists are imprisoned. Because they are civilians, they are not subject to a military court-martial. Their cases are turned over to the civilian authorities of the Provincial Congress. But with the British invasion now imminent, there is no time for lengthy trials. Matthews and the others are eventually sent to prisons in Connecticut, far from the theater of war, where they can no longer do any harm. They are, in a sense, the lucky ones. They escape the gallows that claimed Thomas Hickey. For Governor Tryon, watching from the deck of the Duchess of Gordon, the execution is a major setback. His carefully constructed plot has been discovered and dismantled. His network of agents in the city is in disarray. His plan for a fifth-column uprising has been thwarted. He has lost his most valuable asset inside Washington's command. But Tryon is not a man to be easily discouraged. The failure of the conspiracy is a tactical defeat, but the strategic situation is still overwhelmingly in his favor. The fleet is arriving. Day by day, more ships appear on the horizon. Transports carrying thousands of British regulars and German mercenaries, the feared Hessians, drop anchor in the bay. The waters off Staten Island become a floating city of warships and troop carriers. It is the largest expeditionary force the British Empire has ever assembled. The failure of the plot simply means that the conquest of New York will have to be achieved by overwhelming military force, rather than by subterfuge. The battle is coming, and Tryon is confident of its outcome. He has lost a pawn, but he still has a queen and a board full of powerful pieces. The game is far from over. The execution of Thomas Hickey, while a dramatic and pivotal event, does not end the threat to Washington or the Revolution. It merely closes one chapter of a long and brutal story. It demonstrates the high stakes of the conflict and the ruthlessness with which both sides are prepared to fight. The American Revolution will not be a polite debate between gentlemen. It will be a savage war for survival, a war in which the enemy is not always in a red coat, and the greatest danger can sometimes come from within. As the sun sets on June 28, 1776, Washington can take some small satisfaction in knowing that he has survived his first great test as a commander. He has faced down a threat to his army and his own life, and he has emerged stronger. But he knows that the trials he has just endured are nothing compared to what lies ahead. He has won a battle in the shadows. Now he must prepare to fight a war in the unforgiving light of day. The long-term consequences of the Hickey plot rippled far beyond the confines of New York City, profoundly influencing the political and psychological landscape of the entire American Revolution. The plot's discovery and the subsequent execution of the lead conspirator occurred at a moment of extraordinary historical confluence. While New York was grappling with this internal crisis, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia were engaged in the final momentous debate over independence. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a collision of two powerful historical forces, and their impact was mutually reinforcing. For months the delegates in Philadelphia had been inching towards a final break with Great Britain. Men like John Adams of Massachusetts and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia had been pushing relentlessly for independence, but they faced resistance from more cautious delegates, particularly from the middle colonies like New York and Pennsylvania. These moderates still hoped for reconciliation. They feared the finality of a declaration, the leap into the abyss of a full-scale war against the world's greatest superpower. They needed a final compelling reason to believe that the chasm between the colonies and the crown was truly unbridgeable. The news of the plot to assassinate George Washington provided that reason in the most visceral, shocking way imaginable. When Washington's letter detailing the wicked and diabolical plot arrived in Philadelphia, it landed like a thunderclap. The delegates learned that the king's own royal governor, William Tryon, had orchestrated a plan not just to defeat the Continental Army in battle, but to murder its commander in cold blood. This was not the act of a monarch seeking to discipline his wayward subjects. It was the act of a tyrant seeking to crush a people. The plot revealed the true face of British intentions. It stripped away the last vestiges of the fiction that the conflict was a family squabble that could be patched up with petitions and negotiations. It demonstrated that King George III and his ministers were willing to employ any means necessary, assassination, subversion, bribery, to achieve their ends. John Adams and the pro-independence faction seized on the news. It was the ultimate argument against reconciliation. How could they possibly swear allegiance to a king who sanctioned such treachery? The plot personalized the conflict. It was an attack not just on an army, but on a man who was rapidly becoming the symbol of the American cause. To attack Washington was to attack the revolution itself. The news helped to galvanize support and silence the remaining voices of doubt. The moral justification for a complete and final separation from Great Britain was now undeniable. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. It is impossible to draw a straight causal line between the Hickey plot and the signing of the Declaration. The movement towards independence was already well underway, but the plot was a powerful catalyst. It was a gust of wind that fanned the flames of revolution at the critical moment, providing the final emotional impetus for the delegates to take their courageous and terrifying leap. The Declaration of Independence, in turn, reshaped the meaning of the Hickey plot. It transformed it from an act of treason against a provincial army into an act of treason against a new self-proclaimed nation. Thomas Hickey was no longer just a mutinous soldier. He was the first traitor to the United States of America. Back in New York, the Declaration had an equally profound, though more immediate, impact. On July 9th, General Washington ordered the Declaration to be read aloud to his troops. The regiments were assembled on their parade grounds, and in a clear, strong voice the words of Thomas Jefferson rang out across the city. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. For the soldiers of the Continental Army, many of whom were uneducated and fighting for reasons they only vaguely understood. These words were a revelation. The Declaration gave them a reason to fight. They were no longer fighting for the abstract rights of Englishmen, or against an unfair tax. They were fighting for the birth of a new nation, a nation founded on the radical idea of liberty and self-government. They were fighting for their own freedom. The reading of the Declaration, coming so soon after the execution of Hickey, created a powerful psychological moment. The army had just purged itself of its internal traitors. Now, it was being given a new, clear, and noble purpose. The events were two sides of the same coin: the rejection of the old loyalty to the king, and the embrace of a new loyalty to the United States of America. That evening, in a spontaneous outburst of patriotic fervor, a crowd of soldiers and civilians marched to Bowling Green at the southern tip of Manhattan. There, they threw ropes around a massive gilded lead statue of King George III on horseback. They pulled and heaved until the 2-ton statue came crashing to the ground. The crowd cheered wildly as they broke the statue into pieces. It was a hugely symbolic act. The physical representation of the king, the man in whose name the plotters had acted, was destroyed. The lead from the statue was later melted down and cast into 42,088 musket balls to be fired back at the king's own troops. The revolution had come full circle. The metal of tyranny would be reforged into the bullets of liberty. But this moment of patriotic celebration was short-lived. The reality of their situation remained unchanged. In fact, it was growing more desperate by the day. The British fleet in the harbor was now a terrifying spectacle. By mid-August, over 400 ships were anchored in the bay, carrying an army of 32,000 professional soldiers. It was the largest projection of British military power in history. The plot against Washington's life had failed, but the plan to take New York was moving forward with inexorable force. The long-term effect of the plot on Washington himself was significant. The betrayal by a member of his own hand-picked guard instilled in him a new sense of caution, a wariness that would stay with him for the rest of the war. He became more guarded, more reliant on a small, trusted circle of aides. He understood now that the war would be fought not only on the battlefield, but in the shadows, a world of spies, double agents, and assassins. The Hickey plot was his brutal introduction to the world of intelligence and counterintelligence. He learned a valuable lesson that victory depended not just on the strength of your army, but on the quality of your information and the security of your command. This lesson would serve him well in the difficult years to come, leading to the creation of the Culper spy ring and other intelligence networks that would prove vital to the American victory. The plot also hardened Washington. It stripped him of any lingering sentimentality about the nature of his enemy. He now saw the British leadership not as honorable opponents, but as a ruthless force that would stop at nothing to achieve its objectives. This new, colder perspective would be essential for his survival as a commander. He was no longer just a Virginia planter leading a militia. He was a revolutionary leader in a war for national existence, a war with no rules and no quarter given. The summer of 1776 was a crucible for George Washington and for the American Revolution. In the space of a few short weeks, they faced down an internal conspiracy, declared their existence as a new nation, and prepared to face the largest invasion force of the 18th century. The plot to kill Washington had failed, but in its failure it had inadvertently helped to clarify the stakes, unify the cause, and forge the resolve that the young nation would need to endure the long, dark, and bloody years that lay ahead. The story of the Hickey plot does not end with the execution of one traitor or the arrival of the British fleet. Its echoes reverberate through the entirety of the American Revolution, and into the very foundation of the nation that was forged in its fire. It serves as a stark and often overlooked reminder of the profound fragility of the American cause in the summer of 1776. We tend to view the revolution through the lens of its eventual success, a teleological narrative that marches inevitably towards victory at Yorktown and the signing of the Constitution. But in that sweltering June in New York, nothing was inevitable. The entire enterprise was balanced on a knife's edge, and the conspiracy to kill George Washington was one of several moments where it could have all come crashing down. What if the plot had succeeded? The question is a chilling one for anyone who studies this period. The death of the commander-in-chief at that precise moment would have been a cataclysm from which the revolution would likely not have recovered. Washington was more than just a general. He was the indispensable man. He was the one figure who commanded the respect of all 13 colonies, the unifying force that held the fractious Continental Army together. His loss would have created a vacuum of leadership that no other figure, not Charles Lee, not Horatio Gates, not any of the other ambitious generals, could have filled. The army, leaderless and demoralized, would have shattered. The Continental Congress, its military arm destroyed, would have lost all credibility. The British would have taken New York with ease, and the rebellion would have collapsed, remembered by history as a brief, foolish, and tragic failure. the United States of America would have been stillborn, a footnote in the annals of the British Empire. Reflecting on the plot also forces us to confront the deep divisions that existed within American society at the time. The popular image of the revolution is often one of a united people rising up as one against tyranny. The reality was far more complex and far messier. The population was likely split into thirds: 1/3 ardent patriots, 1/3 dedicated loyalists, and 1/3 who were ambivalent, caught in the middle, wishing only for peace and to be left alone. The Hickey plot was not the work of a few isolated individuals. It was the manifestation of this deep societal fissure. It was a civil war in miniature, a struggle that pitted neighbor against neighbor, and in the case of Thomas Hickey, brother-in-arms against brother-in-arms. This internal conflict was, in many ways, a more insidious threat than the British Army. An army can be met on the field of battle, but how do you fight a war against whispers, rumors, and secret loyalties? How do you build a nation when a significant portion of your own population actively wishes for your failure? This was the challenge that Washington and the other revolutionary leaders faced. They had to win not just a military victory, but a battle for the hearts and minds of the people. The execution of Hickey, as brutal as it was a necessary act in that larger struggle. It was a demonstration that the new nation, even before it was formally declared, had the will to defend itself, to define its own laws, and to punish those who betrayed it. It was an act of state-building, carried out on a gallows field. The legacy of the plot also speaks to the character of George Washington. His handling of the crisis reveals many of the qualities that would make him such an effective leader. He did not panic. He did not overreact. He did not use the plot as a pretext to seize dictatorial power, as a lesser man might have done. Instead, he deferred to the civilian authority of the New York Provincial Congress, allowing their secret committee to lead the investigation. He insisted on a formal legal court-martial for Hickey, ensuring that justice was not only done, but was seen to be done. In his actions, he modeled the very principles the revolution was supposedly about: the rule of law, civilian control of the military, and due process. He understood that the means by which they fought the war were just as important as the ends. To resort to tyranny in the name of liberty would be to lose the war before the first major battle had even been fought. After the crisis passed, Washington did not dwell on the personal betrayal. His correspondence from the period shows a man almost entirely focused on the immense military challenge before him. He had survived the assassin's plot, but now he had to survive the British Army. The Battle of Long Island, fought in late August 1776, would be a disaster for the Continental Army. They were outmaneuvered, outfought, and nearly destroyed. Washington was forced into a desperate retreat, abandoning New York City to the British, who would occupy it for the remainder of the war. The dark winter of 1776 would follow, a time of constant retreat and defeat, a time when the revolutionary cause seemed truly lost. But Washington endured. He held the battered army together through sheer force of will, leading them across the Delaware River on Christmas night to a stunning victory at Trenton that saved the revolution from collapse. The man who survived the Hickey plot would go on to survive Valley Forge, the Conway Cabal, and years of grinding warfare, his resolve hardened by the knowledge that the enemy he faced was both without and within. The Hickey plot is now a largely forgotten episode, a footnote in the grand sweep of the American Revolution, but it is a story that deserves to be remembered. It reminds us that history is not a predetermined path, but a series of contingent moments, of choices made by individuals under immense pressure. It reminds us that the American experiment was not born in a moment of pure unified glory, but in a crucible of conflict, conspiracy, and betrayal. And it reminds us that the nation's survival, in its earliest and most vulnerable days, depended on the foiling of a secret plot and on the strength and wisdom of the one man they could not afford to lose.